Can you even cook? Or did you just come for the free dinner? My daughter-in-law asked loudly enough for half the ballroom to hear. A few people chuckled. Someone coughed to hide a laugh. I smiled, folded my hands in my lap, and looked down at the linen tablecloth. 5 minutes later, nobody in that room was laughing. I'm Margaret Hayes, 68 years old, a widow, a mother, and apparently an embarrassment to my daughter-in-law Rebecca. At least that's how she liked to make me feel. The military family appreciation banquet was being held in a beautiful hotel outside Richmond, Virginia. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. American flags stood proudly near the stage. Round tables filled the ballroom, each covered with white linens and small arrangements of blue and silver flowers. It should have been a wonderful evening. Families gathered together. Veterans shared stories. Children ran between tables wearing miniature dress uniforms. But from the moment I arrived, I knew Rebecca wished I hadn't come. "Mom, you can sit over there," my son Daniel said as he pointed toward a table near the back of the room. Not with him. Not with Rebecca. Not even with my grandchildren. Near the back. Close to the kitchen doors. Close to the servers carrying trays of food. I nodded and thanked him anyway. That's what mothers do when they spend years convincing themselves that small hurts don't matter. Rebecca looked beautiful that evening. Her navy dress matched Daniel's suit perfectly. She smiled for photographs. She greeted people warmly. She played the role of the perfect military spouse so well that nobody seemed to notice the coldness hiding beneath her polished smile. When dinner service began, she walked past my table and glanced at my plate. "Can you even cook? Or did you just come for the free dinner?" she asked. The people around her laughed politely. Not because the joke was funny. Because nobody wants to be the person who makes a social gathering uncomfortable. I didn't answer. I simply picked up my water glass and took a sip. The truth was, I had spent most of my adult life cooking for other people. I had cooked during deployments, birthdays, holidays, promotions, and homecomings. I had cooked when money was tight and when it wasn't. But explaining that would have changed nothing. Rebecca didn't want information. She wanted an audience. Across the room, Daniel pretended not to hear. That hurt more than the joke itself. There was a time when my son would have crossed a football field to defend me. Now he couldn't cross a ballroom. I stared at the stage and reminded myself to stay calm. The evening would end soon. I would drive home alone. Tomorrow would be another day. Then the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone. Conversations faded. Forks stopped moving. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we are honored tonight by the presence of a very special guest." Something changed in the room. Heads turned toward the entrance. Uniformed officers stood straighter. Even Rebecca stopped talking. And for reasons I couldn't yet explain, a strange feeling settled in my chest as the ballroom doors slowly opened. The ballroom doors opened slowly, and a hush settled across the room. Conversations stopped in mid-sentence. Even the clinking of silverware seemed to disappear. I watched as a tall man in dress uniform stepped inside, his presence commanding attention without saying a single word. Decorations and polished tables suddenly felt less important. Every eye followed him. The master of ceremonies smiled broadly. Several officers near the stage straightened their posture immediately. I could feel the energy in the room changing, shifting from casual conversation to something far more serious. Rebecca leaned forward in her chair, suddenly interested. Daniel adjusted his jacket. Around me, guests whispered quietly, trying to identify the distinguished visitor. I remained seated at my table near the back of the ballroom. At 68, I had attended enough military events to understand that rank carried weight. But I also understood something many people forgot. The people wearing the uniforms were not the only ones who served. Families served too. Wives served. Children served. Entire households quietly carried burdens that never appeared in official records. The man entering the ballroom wore 3 stars on his shoulders. A 3-star general. The room practically vibrated with admiration. Rebecca immediately turned toward Daniel. I saw her expression change. The same woman who had mocked me only minutes earlier now looked eager to be noticed by someone important. She brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear and smiled toward the front of the room. It was a smile I had seen many times before. The smile she used whenever status entered the picture. I looked down at my water glass. Condensation had formed around the base. Tiny droplets slid slowly across the tablecloth. Strange how little details become noticeable when old memories begin returning. Military banquets. Homecoming ceremonies, promotion dinners, retirement celebrations. For decades, my life had revolved around events just like this one. Yet sitting there alone, you never would have guessed it. The general shook hands with several people near the entrance. Photographs were taken. A few local officials approached him eagerly. Rebecca whispered something to Daniel, and both of them laughed softly. They were already imagining how impressive it would be to meet him. Across the ballroom, servers continued moving quietly between tables. The smell of roast chicken and warm dinner rolls lingered in the air. Everything appeared normal. But beneath the surface, I felt something I had not felt in years. Not excitement, not anxiety, recognition, as if an old chapter of my life was slowly opening again. The general continued moving through the room, greeting guests politely. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of heading toward the stage, he stopped. His eyes scanned the ballroom. Slowly, deliberately, table by table. Conversation faded again as people noticed. He seemed to be searching for someone. The master of ceremonies paused awkwardly beside the microphone. Several organizers exchanged confused glances. The general ignored them. His gaze continued moving through the crowd until it reached the back of the room. Until it reached my table. And then, to my complete surprise, he smiled. For a moment I wondered if I was imagining it. The general stood near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by people far more important than me. Yet his attention remained fixed on my table. His smile widened slightly, the kind of smile people reserve for someone they genuinely remember. Around me, heads began turning. Guests looked from him to me and back again. I could almost hear the unspoken question moving through the room. Why was he looking at the woman sitting alone near the kitchen doors? Rebecca noticed it too. Her confident expression faded. Daniel looked confused. The general excused himself from the small crowd gathered around him and started walking across the ballroom. Not toward the stage. Not toward the local officials. Not toward the event organizers. Toward me. Every step seemed to make the room quieter. I felt my heartbeat quicken. It had been many years since I had attended events at this level. Many years since my life revolved around military schedules, deployment calendars, family readiness meetings, and support networks. I had become accustomed to being overlooked. Invisible, almost. Yet as he approached, memories I had not thought about in decades began returning. Long nights waiting for phone calls. Early mornings organizing care packages. Countless hours helping young military spouses adjust to difficult circumstances. None of it had ever seemed extraordinary at the time. It was simply what needed to be done. The general stopped beside my table. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. Then he extended his hand. "Mrs. Margaret Hayes," he said warmly. "I was hoping you would be here tonight." The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Several people nearby gasped softly. I stood and shook his hand. "General Whitaker," I replied. "It has been a long time." He laughed gently. "Too long." Around us, conversations had completely stopped. Rebecca stared openly now. Daniel looked as though he was trying to solve a puzzle. The general motioned toward an empty chair and sat beside me as if there were nothing unusual about it. "You probably do not remember this," he said. "But 27 years ago, when I was a young major stationed in North Carolina, my wife was struggling. We were new to military life. We had 2 small children. We knew almost nobody. I remembered immediately. A young family. A nervous young wife. 2 energetic little boys. Your wife loved blueberry pie," I said before I could stop myself. The general laughed again. "She still does." Several people around us smiled. "Margaret," he continued, "you were one of the first people who welcomed us. You helped my family when we needed it most." I lowered my eyes. I had helped dozens of families over the years. Hundreds, perhaps. Most military spouses did. That was simply how the community worked. But General Whitaker shook his head as if reading my thoughts. "You always did that," he said. "You never realized how much your kindness mattered." Across the ballroom, I saw Rebecca slowly sit down. For the first time that evening, she had nothing to say. And somehow I knew the night was only beginning. The general leaned back slightly and looked around the ballroom. His eyes moved across the tables, across the officers, the guests, and finally toward the stage. "Most people only see the medals, the promotions, and the ceremonies," he said. "They rarely see the people who quietly hold everything together behind the scenes." Nobody interrupted him. The room remained completely still. Even the servers paused near the walls. I felt uncomfortable being the center of attention. I always had. Throughout my life, I had been far more comfortable helping others stand in the spotlight than standing there myself. General Whitaker smiled at me again. When my family arrived at Fort Bragg, we knew almost nobody. My wife was overwhelmed. I was working long hours. We were trying to build a life from scratch. He shook his head softly. Margaret Hayes showed up with a casserole, a list of local resources, and enough kindness to make us feel like we belonged. A few people laughed warmly. That may not sound important, he continued. But when you are a young military family far from home, it means everything. I lowered my gaze toward the tablecloth. The memories came back clearly now. Potluck dinners, family readiness meetings, phone trees, holiday events, new spouses arriving nervous and uncertain. It had never felt extraordinary. It was simply what military families did for one another. Yet as the general spoke, I began realizing how many years had passed since anyone had acknowledged that part of my life. Margaret helped more families than she probably remembers, he said. When deployments became difficult, she organized support. When families needed meals, she found volunteers. When someone felt alone, she somehow always knew. Several older guests nodded knowingly. Some appeared emotional. Across the room, I noticed Rebecca staring down at her hands. She no longer looked confident. Daniel sat beside her, unusually quiet. The general continued speaking. There is a reason people remember certain names long after retirement ceremonies end. It is not because of rank. It is because of character. Those words seemed to settle over the room like a blanket. I saw Daniel glance toward me for the first time that evening. Really look at me. Not as an obligation. Not as an aging parent sitting at the wrong table. But as a person. Perhaps even as the woman who had raised him. The realization brought no satisfaction. Only sadness. Because I knew how long it had taken to reach that moment. General Whitaker stood and adjusted his jacket. I have attended events across the country, he said. And whenever military families speak about people who changed their lives, one name appears again and again. He paused. His eyes met mine. Margaret Hayes. The room erupted into applause. Not polite applause. Genuine applause. People stood. Chairs moved. Hands came together throughout the ballroom. I remained seated for a moment, overwhelmed by the sound. Then I slowly rose to my feet. And as I looked across the room, I saw something I had not expected. For the first time in many years, Rebecca could not look me in the eye. The applause continued longer than I expected. Some people remained standing. Others wiped their eyes. I stood there feeling strangely disconnected from the moment, as though it were happening to someone else. For years, I had grown accustomed to being overlooked. Recognition was never the goal. Service rarely comes with applause. Most of the meaningful things people do happen quietly, behind closed doors, without cameras or speeches. Eventually the room settled down, and General Whitaker remained beside me. There is one more thing people should know, he said. A curious silence returned immediately. The general reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded sheet of paper. Last month, he continued, the National Military Family Foundation completed a review of nominations from across the country. He smiled in my direction. The selection committee chose a single recipient for this year's Lifetime Service Recognition Award. Murmurs spread through the ballroom. I had never heard of the award. Neither had most people in the room. General Whitaker unfolded the paper and looked directly at me. Margaret Hayes was selected unanimously. For a second, I simply stared at him. I genuinely thought he must have made a mistake. Me? After all these years? The general laughed softly when he saw my expression. That was exactly the reaction I expected. More laughter rippled through the audience. The committee reviewed decades of volunteer records, family support programs, scholarship fundraising efforts, and community outreach projects. Your name appeared everywhere. My hands trembled slightly. Not from pride. From memory. I remembered the military spouses who needed rides to appointments. The children whose parents were deployed during birthdays and graduations. The families who sat around kitchen tables wondering how they would make it through another difficult season. I had simply tried to help where I could. Nothing more. Yet hearing those years summarized so publicly felt overwhelming. Across the ballroom, I noticed several older military spouses smiling at me. One woman pressed a hand against her heart. Another nodded through tears. They understood. They knew what those years had looked like. Then I saw Daniel. His expression had changed completely. The confusion was gone now. In its place was something heavier. Regret. He looked down at the table for several seconds before finally raising his eyes toward me. Our gaze met briefly, for the first time in a very long while. He seemed to remember who I was before I became simply his aging mother. Rebecca remained silent. She sat perfectly still, her earlier confidence nowhere to be found. The woman who had spent years controlling every social situation suddenly had no control at all. The evening was no longer following her script. General Whitaker carefully handed me the award certificate. "Thank you," he said quietly enough that only I could hear, "for everything you did for families like mine." I looked at the document, then back at him. "I was never alone," I replied. "There were many people helping." He smiled knowingly. "That answer is exactly why you earned it." After the presentation ended, people began approaching my table one after another. Some introduced themselves. Others shared memories. A retired sergeant told me that his wife still used a support guide I had helped create years earlier. Another woman said her daughter had received a scholarship from a military family fund I once volunteered with. Each conversation felt like opening a small window into a chapter of life I had nearly forgotten. For so many years, I had measured my worth by what remained in front of me. An empty house, fewer phone calls, holidays that felt quieter than they once had. I had not realized how many pieces of my past were still alive in other people's lives. The ballroom slowly transformed. Earlier that evening, I had felt invisible sitting near the kitchen doors. Now people kept pulling chairs toward my table. Laughter replaced the uncomfortable silence that had surrounded me before. I noticed that Rebecca had stopped being the center of attention. Nobody was ignoring her intentionally. The room had simply shifted. People were interested in stories she could not tell because she had never lived them. Daniel finally stood and walked toward me. He hesitated before speaking. For a moment, he looked like the young boy who used to wait by the front window whenever his father came home. "Mom," he said quietly. I did not know. I looked at him carefully. His voice carried genuine emotion, but it also carried something else. "Shame. There was a lot you did not know," I replied softly. He nodded. Neither of us said anything for several seconds. Sometimes silence reveals more than words. Daniel glanced toward the award certificate resting beside my plate. "Why did you never tell me about any of this?" he asked. I smiled faintly. "Because it was never about me." That answer seemed to affect him more than anything General Whitaker had said. He lowered his eyes and sat beside me. Across the room, Rebecca remained seated at her table. Her expression was impossible to read now. The confidence, the clever remarks, the social performance that had seemed so important earlier had all disappeared. For the first time in years, she looked uncertain. The master of ceremonies returned to the stage and announced the remainder of the evening's program. Yet people continued approaching my table. The schedule no longer seemed important. General Whitaker had awakened something larger than a ceremony. He had reminded people of the quiet contributions that often go unnoticed. As I listened to the conversations around me, I realized something unexpected. I no longer felt angry about the comment Rebecca had made earlier. The hurt was still there, but it had changed shape. Her words had revealed far more about her character than about mine. I picked up my water glass and looked around the ballroom once more. Nothing about the room had changed. The same tables, the same chandeliers, the same guests. Yet everything felt different. Not because people suddenly admired me, because I finally remembered something I should never have forgotten. My value had never depended on whether someone recognized it. The evening continued, but for me time seemed to move differently now. Earlier, every minute had felt heavy. Every glance had carried a hidden message. Every silence had felt personal. Now I sat quietly and watched people interact around me, noticing details I had overlooked before. Respect has a way of changing a room. Not because it alters the furniture or the lighting, but because it changes how people choose to see one another. Daniel remained beside me for much of the evening. We did not talk constantly. In fact, some of our longest moments together passed without a single word. Yet there was a difference. He was present, truly present. It reminded me of years ago when he would sit at the kitchen counter while I prepared dinner, telling me about school, friends, and dreams for the future. Somewhere along the way, life had become crowded with responsibilities, careers, schedules, and expectations. The connection had faded so gradually that neither of us seemed to notice it disappearing. "Mom," he finally said, staring at the award certificate again. "Dad would have been proud tonight." The mention of Richard brought an unexpected warmth to my chest. I looked toward one of the flags displayed near the stage and smiled softly. Your father never cared much about recognition, I said. He believed that character mattered more than applause. Daniel nodded slowly. That sounds exactly like him. For a moment, we both laughed. It was a small laugh. A quiet one. But it felt real. Across the ballroom, I noticed Rebecca speaking with a few guests. Her voice was lower now. Her gestures more restrained. She no longer seemed interested in being the center of attention. Several times I caught her looking toward our table. Each time, she quickly looked away. I found myself studying her with a different perspective. For years, I had assumed her behavior was entirely about me. But sitting there, I began wondering whether it had more to do with her own insecurities. Some people spend so much energy trying to appear important that they fail to recognize importance when it sits right beside them. The thought did not excuse her behavior. It simply helped me understand it. As dessert was served, General Whitaker returned briefly to our table. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder and smiled. Your parents were remarkable people, he said. Daniel looked surprised. Both of them. The general chuckled. Especially both of them. He then shared several stories about Richard that I had not heard in years. Stories about leadership, integrity, and quiet courage. Yet every story seemed to circle back to the same theme. Service was never a solo act. Families carried part of the responsibility too. When the general eventually moved on to greet other guests, Daniel remained thoughtful. I think I forgot that, he admitted quietly. Forgot what? I asked. He looked directly at me. Everything you gave up so the rest of us could move forward. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Some truths do not require speeches. Some moments do not require victory. Sometimes healing begins with a simple acknowledgement that should have happened years ago. By the time coffee was served, the atmosphere in the ballroom felt completely different from the one that had greeted me a few hours earlier. The sharp edges had softened. Conversations seemed warmer. People lingered at tables instead of rushing through introductions. I sat quietly, listening more than speaking. That had always been my nature. Yet something unexpected happened as the evening moved toward its conclusion. Several younger military spouses approached me together. They looked nervous, almost the way General Whitaker's wife had looked decades ago. One of them carried a notebook. Another held a phone filled with notes. Mrs. Hayes, one woman said, would you mind if we asked you something? I smiled. Of course. She exchanged glances with the others before speaking. How did you do it? I laughed softly. Do what? Support a military family for so many years and still stay positive. The question caught me off guard. For a moment, I looked down at my coffee cup. The answer was not simple. Life rarely is. I was not always positive, I admitted. There were difficult days. Lonely days. Days when I doubted myself. Their expressions became more attentive. But I learned something important. You cannot control every challenge that enters your life. You can only control the kind of person you choose to become while facing it. They listened carefully. I could see them storing each word away. Not because I was special, but because experience carries a different weight than advice. Across the room, Daniel was speaking with General Whitaker. The two men appeared deep in conversation. Every so often Daniel glanced toward me. Each time, his expression softened a little more. It was as though he was seeing old photographs in his mind and finally connecting them to the woman sitting across the room. Rebecca remained nearby, quieter than I had ever seen her. Eventually, she stood and slowly walked toward my table. The younger spouses politely excused themselves and moved away. Rebecca stopped beside me. For a second, neither of us spoke. The ballroom noise seemed distant. Margaret, she said carefully, I think there are many things about you that I never understood. It was not quite an apology. Not yet. But it was the closest she had come in years. I studied her face. The arrogance I had grown accustomed to seeing was gone. In its place was uncertainty. Perhaps even humility. Most people only see a small part of someone else's story, I replied. That is true for all of us. She nodded slowly. There was no argument. No clever remark. No attempt to change the subject. Just silence. Strange how powerful silence can be when honesty finally enters the room. As she returned to her table, I felt no desire to embarrass her or remind her of earlier comments. The evening had already delivered its lesson. Not through revenge. Through perspective. I looked around the ballroom one final time. The flags near the stage stood motionless. Families laughed together. Friends exchanged phone numbers. Young children chased one another between tables. And for the first time in many years, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Not recognition, not validation, belonging. The banquet ended an hour later, but the real change did not happen inside that ballroom. It happened afterward. As people gathered their coats and said their goodbyes, I stood near the entrance holding the certificate under one arm. Guests stopped to shake my hand. Several younger families thanked me for the advice I had shared. Others simply smiled. The evening that had begun with embarrassment was ending with something entirely different. Respect. Not the loud kind that comes from titles or awards. The quiet kind that grows when people finally see the truth. Daniel walked beside me as we headed toward the parking lot. The cool Virginia air felt refreshing after hours inside the crowded ballroom. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he stopped near my car. "Mom," he said, "I owe you an apology." I looked at him carefully. He was no longer speaking as a successful professional or a husband trying to keep peace at home. He was speaking as my son. "You do not owe me perfection," I replied gently. "You only owe me honesty." He lowered his head. "Then honestly, I stopped paying attention. I assumed I knew your story because I knew you." Those words stayed with me. How often do people do that? We believe we know someone simply because they have always been there. We stop asking questions. We stop listening. We stop noticing. "Thank you for saying that," I told him. He nodded slowly. Then, to my surprise, he wrapped his arms around me. It had been a long time since my son had hugged me without rushing through it. I closed my eyes for a second and allowed myself to enjoy the moment. Nearby, Rebecca stood quietly waiting. When Daniel stepped back, she approached. "Margaret," she said softly, "I was unkind tonight." There was no excuse attached. No explanation. Just the truth. I appreciated that. "We all have moments we wish we could redo," I said. She looked relieved, though still embarrassed. "I would like to do better," she added. I studied her face. For the first time since she joined our family, I sensed that she was speaking without a mask. "Then start there," I replied. She nodded. We exchanged a small smile. Nothing dramatic. Nothing perfect. Just a beginning. As I drove home later that night, the roads were nearly empty. The certificate rested on the passenger seat. Streetlights passed across the windshield in steady intervals. I thought about Richard. I thought about the families we had known. I thought about the young spouses at the banquet and the lessons life had taught all of us. By the time I reached my driveway, I understood something clearly. The most important moment of the evening was not the applause. It was not the award. It was not even the recognition from a respected general. The most important moment happened when I remembered my own worth before anyone else reminded me of it. Respect that depends on other people can disappear, but self-respect stays. And sometimes the greatest victory is not proving others wrong. It is finally remembering who you were all along.